Part 1, Chapter 9 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 9. I had just given a porter the necessary directions for taking my portmanteau to Mr. Keller's house, when I heard a woman's voice behind me, asking the way to the poste restante, or, in our roundabout English phrase, the office of letters to be left till called for. The voice was delightfully fresh and sweet, with an undertone of sadness which made it additionally interesting. I did what most other young men in my place would have done. I looked round directly. Yes, the promise of the voice was abundantly kept by the person. She was quite a young girl, modest and ladylike, a little pale and careworn, poor thing, as if her experience of life had its sad side already. Her face was animated by soft, sensitive eyes, the figure supple and slight, the dress of the plainest material, but so neatly made and so perfectly worn that I should have doubted her being a German girl if I had not heard the purely South German accent in which she put her question. It was answered briefly and civilly by the conductor of the post carriage in which I had travelled, but at that hour the old courtyard of the post office was thronged with people arriving and departing, meeting their friends and posting their letters. The girl was evidently not used to crowds. She was nervous and confused. After advancing a few steps in the direction pointed out to her, she stopped in bewilderment, hustled by busy people, and evidently in doubt already about which way she was to turn next. If I had followed the strict line of duty, I suppose I should have turned my steps in the direction of Mr. Keller's house. I followed my instincts instead, and offered my services to the young lady. Blame the laws of nature and the attraction between the sexes. Don't blame me. "I heard you asking for the post office," I said. "Will you allow me to show you the way?" She looked at me and hesitated. I felt I was paying the double penalty of being a young man, and of being perhaps a little too eager as well. "Forgive me for venturing to speak to you," I pleaded. "It is not very pleasant for a young lady to find herself alone in such a crowded place as this. I only ask permission to make myself of some trifling use to you." She looked at me again, and altered her first opinion. "You are very kind, sir. I will thankfully accept your assistance." "May I offer you my arm?" She declined this proposal with perfect amiability, however. "Thank you, sir. I will follow you, if you please." I pushed my way through the crowd, with the charming stranger close at my heels. Arrived at the post office, I drew aside to let her make her own inquiries. Would she mention her name? No. She handed in a passport, and asked if there was a letter waiting for the person named in it. The letter was found, but was not immediately delivered. As well as I could understand, the postage had been insufficiently paid, and the customary double rate was due. The young lady searched in the pocket of her dress. A cry of alarm escaped her. "Oh!" she exclaimed, "I have lost my purse, and the letter is so important." It occurred to me immediately that she had had her pocket picked by some thief in the crowd. The clerk thought so too. He looked at the clock. "You must be quick about it if you return for the letter," he said. "The office closes in 10 minutes." She clasped her hands in despair. "It's more than 10 minutes' walk," she said, "before I can get home." I immediately offered to lend her the money. "It is such a very small sum," I reminded her, "that it would be absurd to consider yourself under any obligation to me." Between her eagerness to get possession of the letter, and her doubt of the propriety of accepting my offer, she looked sadly embarrassed, poor soul. "You are very good to me," she said confusedly, "but I am afraid it might not be quite right in me to borrow money of a stranger, however little it may be, and even if I did venture, How am I—" She looked at me shyly, and shrank from finishing the sentence. "How are you to pay it back?" I suggested. "Yes, sir." "Oh, it's not worth the trouble of paying back. Give it to the first poor person you meet with to morrow." I said this with the intention of reconciling her to the loan of the money. It had exactly the contrary effect on this singularly delicate and scrupulous girl. She drew back a step directly. "No, I couldn't do that," she said. "I could only accept your kindness if—" She stopped again. The clerk looked once more at the clock. "Make up your mind, miss, before it's too late." In her terror of not getting the letter that day, she spoke out plainly at last. "Will you kindly tell me, sir, to what address I can return the money when I get home?" I paid for the letter first, and then answered the question. "If you will be so kind as to send it to Mr. Keller's house." Before I could add the name of the street, her pale face suddenly flushed. "Oh!" she exclaimed impulsively. "Do you know Mr. Keller?" A presentiment of the truth occurred to my mind for the first time. "Yes," I said. "And his son Fritz, too." She trembled. The color that had risen in her face left it instantly. She looked away from me with a pained, humiliated expression. Doubt was no longer possible. The charming stranger was Fritz's sweetheart, and Jezebel's daughter. My respect for the young lady forbade me to attempt any concealment of the discovery that I had made. I said at once, "I believe I have the honor of speaking to Miss Minna Fontaine?" She looked at me in wonder, not unmixed with distrust. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. "I can easily tell you, Miss Minna. I am David Glenney, nephew of Mrs. Wagner of London. Fritz is staying in her house, and he and I have talked about you by the hour together." The poor girl's face, so pale and sad the moment before, became radiant with happiness. "Oh!" she cried innocently, "has Fritz not forgotten me?" Even at this distance of time, my memory recalls her lovely dark eyes riveted in breathless interest on my face, as I spoke of Fritz's love and devotion, and told her that she was still the one dear image in his thoughts by day, in his dreams by night. All her shyness vanished. She impulsively gave me her hand. "How can I be grateful enough to the good angel who has brought us together?" she exclaimed. "If we were not in the street, I do believe, Mr. David, I should go down on my knees to thank you. You have made me the happiest girl living." Her voice suddenly failed her. She drew her veil down. "Don't mind me," she said. "I can't help crying for joy." Shall I confess what my emotions were? For the moment I forgot my own little love affair in England, and envied Fritz from the bottom of my heart. The chance passengers in the street began to pause and look at us. I offered Minna my arm, and asked permission to attend her on the way home. "I should like it," she answered, with a friendly frankness that charmed me. "But you are expected at Mr. Keller's. You must go there first." "May I call and see you to morrow?" I persisted, "and save you the trouble of sending my money to Mr. Keller's?" She lifted her veil, and smiled at me brightly through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Come to morrow, and be introduced to my mother. Oh, how glad my dear mother will be to see you, when I tell her what has happened! I am a selfish wretch. I have not borne my sorrow and suspense as I ought. I have made her miserable about me, because I was miserable about Fritz. It's all over now, thank you, again and again. There is our address on that card. No, no, we must say good bye till to morrow. My mother is waiting for her letter, and Mr. Keller is wondering what has become of you." She pressed my hand warmly, and left me. On my way alone to Mr. Keller's house, I was not quite satisfied with myself. The fear occurred to me that I might have spoken about Fritz a little too freely, and might have excited hopes which could never be realized. The contemplation of the doubtful future began to oppress my mind. Minna might have reason to regret that she had ever met with me. I was received by Mr. Keller with truly German cordiality. He and his partner, Mr. Engelmann, one a widower, the other an old bachelor, lived together in the ancient building in Main Street, near the river, which served for house and for offices alike. The two old gentlemen offered the completest personal contrast imaginable. Mr. Keller was lean, tall, and wiry, a man of considerable attainments beyond the limits of his business, capable, when his hot temper was not excited, of speaking sensibly and strongly on any subject in which he was interested. Mr. Engelmann, short and fat, devoted to the office during the hours of business, had never read a book in his life, and had no aspiration beyond the limits of his garden and his pipe. "In my leisure moments," he used to say, "give me my flowers, my pipe, and my peace of mind, and I ask no more." Widely as they differed in character, the two partners had the truest regard for one another. Mr. Engelmann believed Mr. Keller to be the most accomplished and remarkable man in Germany. Mr. Keller was as firmly persuaded on his side that Mr. Engelmann was an angel in sweetness of temper and a model of modest and unassuming good sense. Mr. Engelmann listened to Mr. Keller's learned talk with an ignorant admiration which knew no limit. Mr. Keller, detesting tobacco in all its forms, and taking no sort of interest in horticulture, submitted to the fumes of Mr. Engelmann's pipe, and passed hours in Mr. Engelmann's garden without knowing the names of 9/10 of the flowers that grew in it. There are still such men to be found in Germany and in England. But, oh, dear me, the older I get, the fewer I find there are of them. The two old friends and partners were waiting for me to join them at their early German supper. Specimens of Mr. Engelmann's flowers adorned the table in honor of my arrival. He presented me with a rose from the nosegay when I entered the room. "And how did you leave dear Mrs. Wagner?" he inquired. "And how is my boy Fritz?" asked Mr. Keller. I answered in terms which satisfied them both, and the supper proceeded gaily. But when the table was cleared, and Mr. Engelmann had lit his pipe, and I had kept him company with a cigar, then Mr. Keller put the fatal question: "And now tell me, David, do you come to us on business, or do you come to us on pleasure?" I had no alternative but to produce my instructions, and to announce the contemplated invasion of the office by a select army of female clerks. The effect produced by the disclosure was highly characteristic of the widely different temperaments of the two partners. Mild Mr. Engelmann laid down his pipe and looked at Mr. Keller in helpless silence. Irritable Mr. Keller struck his fist on the table and appealed to Mr. Engelmann with fury in his looks. "What did I tell you," he asked, "when we first heard that Mr. Wagner's widow was appointed head partner in the business? How many opinions of philosophers on the moral and physical incapacities of women did I quote? Did I, or did I not, begin with the ancient Egyptians and end with Dr. Bernestrokius, our neighbor in the next street?" Poor Mr. Engelmann looked frightened. "Don't be angry, my dear friend," he said softly. "Angry?" repeated Mr. Keller, more furiously than ever. "My good Engelmann, you never were more absurdly mistaken in your life. I am delighted. Exactly what I expected, exactly what I predicted, has come to pass. Put down your pipe. I can bear a great deal, but tobacco smoke is beyond me at such a crisis as this. And do for once overcome your constitutional indolence. Consult your memory. Recall my own words when we were first informed that we had a woman for head partner." "She was a very pretty woman when I first saw her," Mr. Engelmann remarked. "Pooh!" cried Mr. Keller. "I didn't mean to offend you," said Mr. Engelmann. "Allow me to present you with one of my roses as a peace offering. Will you be quiet and let me speak? My dear Keller, I am always too glad to hear you speak. You put ideas into my poor head, and my poor head lets them out, and then you put them in again. What noble perseverance! If I live a while longer, I do really think you will make a cleverer man of me. Let me put the rose in your buttonhole for you. And, I say, I wish you would allow me to go on with my pipe." Mr. Keller made a gesture of resignation and gave up his partner in despair. "I appeal to you, David," he said, and poured the full flow of his learning and his indignation into my unlucky ears. Mr. Engelmann, enveloped in clouds of tobacco smoke, enjoyed in silence the composing influence of his pipe. I said "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," at the right intervals in the flow of Mr. Keller's eloquence. At this distance of time, I cannot pretend to report the long harangue of which I was made the victim. In substance, Mr. Keller held that there were two irremediable vices in the composition of women. Their dispositions presented, morally speaking, a disastrous mixture of the imitativeness of a monkey and the restlessness of a child. Having proved this by copious references to the highest authorities, Mr. Keller logically claimed my aunt as a woman, and, as such, not only incapable of letting well alone, but naturally disposed to imitate her husband on the most superficial and defective sides of his character. I predicted, David, that the fatal disturbance of our steady old business was now only a question of time, and there, in Mrs. Wagner's ridiculous instructions, is the fulfilment of my prophecy. Before we went to bed that night, the partners arrived at two resolutions. Mr. Keller resolved to address a written remonstrance to my aunt. Mr. Engelmann resolved to show me his garden the first thing in the morning. End of Chapter 9 of Part 1. Part 1, Chapter 10 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 10. On the afternoon of the next day, while my two good friends were still occupied by the duties of the office, I stole out to pay my promised visit to Minna and Minna's mother. It was impossible not to arrive at the conclusion that they were indeed in straitened circumstances. Their lodgings were in the cheap suburban quarter of Frankfurt, on the left bank of the river. Everything was scrupulously neat, and the poor furniture was arranged with taste, but no dexterity of management could disguise the squalid shabbiness of the sitting-room into which I was shown. I could not help thinking how distressed Fritz would feel if he could have seen his charming Minna in a place so unworthy of her as this. The rickety door opened, and the Jezebel of the anonymous letter, followed by her daughter, entered the room. There are certain remarkable women in all countries who, whatever sphere they may be seen in, fill that sphere as completely as a great actor fills the stage. Widow Fontaine was one of these noteworthy persons. The wretched little room seemed to disappear when she softly glided into it, and even the pretty Minna herself receded into partial obscurity in her mother's presence. And yet there was nothing in the least obtrusive in the manner of Madame Fontaine, and nothing remarkable in her stature. Her figure, reaching to no more than the middle height, was the well-rounded figure of a woman approaching 40 years of age. The influence she exercised was, in part, attributable, as I suppose, to the supple grace of all her movements, in part to the commanding composure of her expression and the indescribable witchery of her manner. Her dark eyes, never fully opened in my remembrance, looked at me under heavy overhanging upper eyelids. Her enemies saw something sensual in their strange expression. To my mind, it was rather something furtively cruel, except when she looked at her daughter. Sensuality shows itself most plainly in the excessive development of the lower part of the face. Madame Fontaine's lips were thin, and her chin was small. Her profuse black hair was just beginning to be streaked with gray. Her complexion wanted color. In spite of these drawbacks, she was still a striking, I might almost say a startling creature when you first looked at her. And though she only wore the plainest widow's weeds, I don't scruple to assert that she was the most perfectly dressed woman I ever saw. Minna made a modest attempt to present me in due form. Her mother put her aside playfully, and held out both her long, white, powerful hands to me as cordially as if we had known each other for years. "I wait to prove other people before I accept them for my friends," she said. "Mr. David, you have been more than kind to my daughter, and you are my friend at our first meeting." I believe I repeat the words exactly. I wish I could give any adequate idea of the exquisite charm of voice and manner which accompanied them. And yet I was not at my ease with her. I was not drawn to her irresistibly, as I had felt drawn to her daughter. Those dark, steady, heavy-lidded eyes of hers seemed to be looking straight into my heart, and surprising all my secrets. To say that I actually distrusted and disliked her would be far from the truth. Distrust and dislike would have protected me, in some degree at least, from feeling her influence as I certainly did feel it. How that influence was exerted, whether it was through her eyes or through her manner, or, to speak the jargon of these latter days, through some magnetic emanation from her, which invisibly overpowered me, is more than I can possibly say. I can only report that she contrived by slow degrees to subject the action of my will more and more completely to the action of hers, until I found myself answering her most insidious questions as unreservedly as if she had been in very truth my intimate and trusted friend. "And is this your first visit to Frankfurt, Mr. David?" she began. "Oh no, madam. I have been at Frankfurt on 2 former occasions." "Ah, indeed. And have you always stayed with Mr. Keller?" "Always." She looked unaccountably interested when she heard that reply, brief as it was. "Then of course you are intimate with him," she said. "Intimate enough, perhaps, to ask a favor or to introduce a friend?" I made a futile attempt to answer this cautiously. "As intimate, madam, as a young clerk in the business can hope to be with a partner," I said. "A clerk in the business?" she repeated. "I thought you lived in London with your aunt." Here Minna interposed for the first time. "You forget, mamma, that there are 3 names in the business. The inscription over the door in Main Street is Wagner, Keller, and Engelmann. Fritz once told me that the office here in Frankfurt was only the small office, and the grand business was Mr. Wagner's business in London. Am I right, Mr. David?" "Quite right, Miss Minna. But we have no such magnificent flower garden at the London house as Mr. Engelmann's flower garden here. May I offer you a nosegay which he allowed me to gather?" I had hoped to make the flowers a means of turning the conversation to more interesting topics, but the widow resumed her questions while Minna was admiring the flowers. "Then you are Mr. Wagner's clerk?" she persisted. "I was Mr. Wagner's clerk. Mr. Wagner is dead." "Ah! And who takes care of the great business now?" Without well knowing why, I felt a certain reluctance to speak of my aunt and her affairs. But Widow Fontaine's eyes rested on me with a resolute expectation in them which I felt myself compelled to gratify. When she understood that Mr. Wagner's widow was now the chief authority in the business, her curiosity to hear everything that I could tell her about my aunt became all but insatiable. Minna's interest in the subject was, in quite another way, as vivid as her mother's. My aunt's house was the place to which cruel Mr. Keller had banished her lover. The inquiries of the mother and daughter followed each other in such rapid succession that I cannot pretend to remember them now. The last question alone remains vividly impressed on my memory, in connection with the unexpected effect which my answer produced. It was put by the widow in these words: "Your aunt is interested, of course, in the affairs of her partners in this place. Is it possible, Mr. David, that she may one day take the journey to Frankfurt?" "It is quite likely, madam, that my aunt may be in Frankfurt on business before the end of the year." As I replied in those terms, the widow looked round slowly at her daughter. Minna was evidently quite as much at a loss to understand the look as I was. Madame Fontaine turned to me again, and made an apology. "Pardon me, Mr. David, there's a little domestic duty that I had forgotten." She crossed the room to a small table on which writing materials were placed, wrote a few lines, and handed the paper without enclosing it to Minna. "Give this, my love, to our good friend downstairs, and while you are in the kitchen, suppose you make the tea. You will stay and drink tea with us, Mr. David. It is our only luxury, and we always make it ourselves." My first impulse was to find an excuse for declining the invitation. There was something in the air of mystery with which Madame Fontaine performed her domestic duties that was not at all to my taste. But Minna pleaded with me to say yes. "Do stay with us a little longer," she said, in her innocently frank way. "We have so few pleasures in this place." I might perhaps have even resisted Minna, but her mother literally laid hands on me. She seated herself with an air of an empress on a shabby little sofa in the corner of the room, and beckoning me to take my place by her side, laid her cool firm hand persuasively on mine. Her touch filled me with a strange sense of disturbance, half pleasurable, half painful. I don't know how to describe it. Let me only record that I yielded, and that Minna left us together. "I want to tell you the whole truth," said Madame Fontaine, as soon as we were alone, "and I can only do so in the absence of my daughter. You must have seen for yourself that we are very poor." Her hand pressed mine gently. I answered as delicately as I could. I said I was sorry, but not surprised to hear it. "When you kindly helped Minna to get that letter yesterday," she went on, "you were the innocent means of inflicting a disappointment on me. One disappointment more, after others that had gone before it. I came here to place my case before some wealthy relatives of mine in this city. They refused to assist me. I wrote next to other members of my family living in Brussels. The letter of yesterday contained their answer. Another refusal. The landlady of this house is an afflicted creature, with every claim on my sympathies. She, too, is struggling with poverty. If I fail to pay her, it would be too cruel. Only yesterday I felt it my hard duty to give her notice of our departure in a week more. I have just written to recall that notice. The reason is, that I see a gleam of hope in the future, and you, Mr. David, are the friend who has shown it to me." I was more than surprised at this. "May I ask how?" I said. She patted my hand with a playful assumption of petulance. "A little more patience," she rejoined, "and you shall soon hear. If I had only myself to think of, I should not feel the anxieties that now trouble me. I could take a housekeeper's place to morrow. Yes, I was brought up among surroundings of luxury and refinement. I descended in rank when I married. But for all that, I could fill a domestic employment without repining my lot, without losing my self-respect. Adversity is a hard teacher of sound lessons, David. May I call you David? And if you heard of a housekeeper's place vacant, would you tell me of it?" I could hardly understand whether she was in jest or in earnest. She went on without waiting for me to reply. "But I have my daughter to think of," she resumed, "and to add to my anxieties, my daughter has given her heart to Mr. Keller's son. While I and my dear Minna had only our own interests to consider, we might have earned our daily bread together, we might have faced the future with courage. But what might once have been the calm course of our lives is now troubled by a third person, a rival with me in my daughter's love, and, worse still, a man who is forbidden to marry her. Is it wonderful that I feel baffled, disheartened, helpless? Oh, I am not exaggerating. I know my child's nature. She is too delicate, too exquisitely sensitive for the rough world she lives in. When she loves with all her heart and soul. Day by day I have seen her pining and fading under her separation from Fritz. You have revived her hopes for the moment, but the prospect before her remains unaltered. If she loses Fritz, she will die of a broken heart. Oh, God, the one creature I love! And how am I to help her and save her, I don't know." For the first time I heard the fervor of true feeling in her voice. She turned aside from me and hid her face with a wild gesture of despair that was really terrible to see. I tried, honestly tried, to comfort her. "Of one thing at least you may be sure," I said. "Fritz's whole heart is given to your daughter. He will be true to her and worthy of her through all trials." "I don't doubt it," she answered sadly. "I have nothing to say against my girl's choice. Fritz is good and Fritz is true, as you say, but you forget his father. Personally, mind, I despise Mr. Keller." She looked round at me with unutterable contempt flashing through the tears that filled her eyes. "A man who listens to every lie that scandal can utter against the character of a helpless woman, who gives her no opportunity of defending herself. I have written to him and received no answer. Who declares that his son shall never marry my daughter, because we are poor, of course, and who uses attacks on my reputation, which he has never verified, as the excuse for his brutal conduct. Can anybody respect such a man as that? And yet on this despicable creature my child's happiness and my child's life depend. For her sake, no matter what my own feeling may be, I must stoop to defend myself. I must make my opportunity of combating his cowardly prejudice and winning his good opinion in spite of himself. How am I to get a hearing? How am I to approach him? I understand that you are not in a position to help me, but you have done wonders for me nevertheless, and God bless you for it." She lifted my hand to her lips. I foresaw what was coming. I tried to speak, but she gave me no opportunity. Her eloquent enthusiasm rushed into a new flow of words. "Yes, my best of friends, my wisest of advisers," she went on, "you have suggested the irresistible interference of a person whose authority is supreme. Your excellent aunt is the head of the business. Mr. Keller must listen to his charming chief. There is my gleam of hope. On that chance I will sell the last few valuables I possess, and wait till Mrs. Wagner arrives in Frankfurt. You start, David. What is there to alarm you? Do you suppose me capable of presuming on your aunt's kindness, of begging for favors which it may not be perfectly easy for her to grant? Mrs. Wagner knows already from Fritz what our situation is. Let her only see my Minna.
I won't intrude on her myself. My daughter shall plead for me. My daughter shall ask for all I want, an interview with Mr. Keller, and permission to speak in my own defense. Tell me honestly, am I expecting too much if I hope that your aunt will persuade Fritz's father to see me?" It sounded modestly enough in words, but I had my own doubts nevertheless. I had left Mr. Keller working hard at his protest against the employment of women in the office, to be sent to my aunt by that day's post. Knowing them both as I did, I thought it at least probable that a written controversy might be succeeded by a personal estrangement. If Mr. Keller proved obstinate, Mrs. Wagner would soon show him that she had a will of her own. Under those circumstances, no favors could be asked, no favors could be granted, and poor Minna's prospects would be darker than ever. This was one view of the case. I must own, however, that another impression had been produced on me. Something in Madame Fontaine's manner suggested that she might not be quite so modest in her demands on my aunt, when they met at Frankfurt, as she had led me to believe. I was vexed with myself for having spoken too unreservedly, and was quite at a loss to decide what I ought to say in answer to the appeal that had been made to me. In this state of perplexity, I was relieved by a welcome interruption. Minna's voice reached us from the landing outside. "I have both hands engaged," she said. "Please let me in." I ran to the door. The widow laid her finger on her lips. "Not a word, mind, to Minna," she whispered. "We understand each other, don't we?" I said, "Yes, certainly," and so the subject was dropped for the rest of the evening. The charming girl came in carrying the tea tray. She especially directed my attention to a cake which she had made that day with her own hands. "I can cook," she said, "and I can make my own dresses, and if Fritz is a poor man when he marries me, I can save him the expense of a servant." Our talk at the tea table was, I dare say, too trifling to be recorded. I only remember that I enjoyed it. Later in the evening, Minna sang to me. I heard one of those simple German ballads again, not long since, and the music brought the tears into my eyes. The moon rose early that night. When I looked at my watch, I found that it was time to go. Minna was at the window, admiring the moonlight. "On such a beautiful night," she said, "it seems a shame to stay indoors. Do let us walk a part of the way back with Mr. David, mamma, only as far as the bridge, to see the moon on the river." Her mother consented, and we three left the house together. Arrived at the bridge, we paused to look at the view, but the clouds were rising already, and the moonlight only showed itself at intervals. Madame Fontaine said she smelt rain in the air, and took her daughter's arm to go home. I offered to return with them as far as their own door, but they positively declined to delay me on my way back. It was arranged that I should call on them again in a day or two. Just as we were saying good night, the fitful moonlight streamed out brightly again through a rift in the clouds. At the same moment, a stout old gentleman, smoking a pipe, sauntered past us on the pavement, noticed me as he went by, stopped directly, and revealed himself as Mr. Engelmann. "Good night, Mr. David," said the widow. The moon shone full on her as she gave me her hand, Minna standing behind her in the shadow. In a moment more the two ladies had left us. Mr. Engelmann's eyes followed the smoothly gliding figure of the widow until it was lost to view at the end of the bridge. He laid his hand eagerly on my arm. "David," he said, "who is that glorious creature?" "Which of the two ladies do you mean?" I asked mischievously. "The one with the widow's cap, of course." "Do you admire the widow, sir?" "Admire her!" repeated Mr. Engelmann. "Look here, David." He showed me the long porcelain bowl of his pipe. "My dear boy, she has done what no woman ever did with me yet. She has put my pipe out." End of chapter 10 of part 1.
Chapter 11 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 11. There was something so absurd in the association of Madame Fontaine's charms with the extinction of Mr. Engelmann's pipe that I burst out laughing. My good old friend looked at me in grave surprise. "What is there to laugh at in forgetting to keep my pipe alight?" he said. "My whole mind, David, was absorbed in that magnificent woman the instant I set eyes on her. The image of her is before me at this moment an image of an angel in moonlight. Am I speaking poetically for the first time in my life? I shouldn't wonder. I really don't know what is the matter with me. You are a young man, and perhaps you can tell. Have I fallen in love, as the saying is?" He took me confidentially by the arm before I could answer this formidable question. "Don't tell friend Keller," he said, with a sudden outburst of alarm. "Keller is an excellent man, but he has no mercy on sinners. I say, David, couldn't you introduce me to her?" Still haunted by the fear that I had spoken too unreservedly during my interview with the widow, I was in the right humor to exhibit extraordinary prudence in my intercourse with Mr. Engelmann. "I couldn't venture to introduce you," I said. "The lady is living here in the strictest retirement." "At any rate, you could tell me her name," pleaded Mr. Engelmann. "I dare say you have mentioned it to Keller." "I have done nothing of the sort. I have reasons for saying nothing about the lady to Mr. Keller." "Well, you can trust me to keep the secret, David. Come, I only want to send her some flowers from my garden. She can't object to that. Tell me where I am to send my nosegay, there's a dear fellow." I dare say I did wrong. Indeed, judging by later events, I know that I did wrong. But I could not view the affair seriously enough to hold out against Mr. Engelmann in this matter of the nosegay. He started when I mentioned the widow's name. "Not the mother of the girl whom Fritz wants to marry?" he exclaimed. "Yes, the same. Don't you admire Fritz's taste? Isn't Miss Minna a charming girl?" "I can't say, David. I was bewitched. I had no eyes for anybody but her mother. Do you think Madame Fontaine noticed me?" "Oh, yes, I saw her look at you." "Turn this way, David. The effect of the moonlight on you seems to make you look younger. Has it the same effect on me? How old should you guess me to be to night? 50 or 60?" "Somewhere between the two, sir." He was close on 70, but who could have been cruel enough to say so at that moment? My answer proved to be so encouraging to the old gentleman that he ventured on the subject of Madame Fontaine's late husband. "Was she very fond of him, David? What sort of man was he?" I informed him that I had never even seen Dr. Fontaine; and then, by way of changing the topic, inquired if I was too late for the regular supper hour at Main Street. "My dear boy, the table was cleared half an hour ago; but I persuaded our sour tempered old housekeeper to keep something hot for you. You won't find Keller very amiable to night, David. He was upset, to begin with, by writing that remonstrance to your aunt, and then your absence annoyed him. This is treating our house like a hotel. I won't allow anybody to take such liberties with us. Yes, that was what he really said of you. He was so cross, poor fellow, that I left him, and went out for a stroll on the bridge and met my fate," added poor Mr. Engelmann, in the saddest tones I had ever heard fall from his lips. "My reception at the house was a little chilly." "I have written my mind plainly to your aunt," said Mr. Keller. "You will probably be recalled to London by return of post. In the meantime, on the next occasion when you spend the evening out, be so obliging as to leave word to that effect with one of the servants." The crabbed old housekeeper, known in the domestic circle as Mother Barbara, had her fling at me next. She set down the dish which she had kept hot for me, with a bang that tried the resisting capacity of the porcelain severely. "I've done it this once," she said. "Next time you're late, you and the dog can suck together." The next day I wrote to my aunt, and also to Fritz, knowing how anxious he must be to hear from me. To tell him the whole truth would probably have been to bring him to Frankfurt as fast as sailing vessels and horses could carry him. All I could venture to say was that I had found the lost trace of Minna and her mother, and that I had every reason to believe there was no cause to feel any present anxiety about them. I added that I might be in a position to forward a letter secretly, if it would comfort him to write to his sweetheart. In making this offer, I was, no doubt, encouraging my friend to disobey the plain commands which his father had laid on him. But, as the case stood, I had really no other alternative. With Fritz's temperament, it would have been simply impossible to induce him to remain in London, unless his patience was sustained in my absence by a practical concession of some kind. In the interests of peace, then, and I must own in the interests of the pretty and interesting Minna as well, I consented to become a medium for correspondence, on the purely Jesuitical principle that the end justified the means. I had promised to let Minna know of it when I wrote to Fritz. My time being entirely at my own disposal, until the vexed question of the employment of women was settled between Mr. Keller and my aunt, I went to the widow's lodgings after putting my letters in the post. Having made Minna happy in the anticipation of hearing from Fritz, I had leisure to notice an old china punch bowl on the table, filled to overflowing with magnificent flowers. To anyone who knew Mr. Engelmann as well as I did, the punch bowl suggested serious considerations. He, who forbade the plucking of a single flower on ordinary occasions, must, with his own hands, have seriously damaged the appearance of his beautiful garden. "What splendid flowers!" I said, feeling my way cautiously. "Mr. Engelmann himself might be envious of such a nosegay as that." The widow's heavy eyelids drooped lower for a moment, in unconcealed contempt for my simplicity. "Do you really think you can mystify me?" she asked ironically. "Mr. Engelmann has done more than send the flowers. He has written me a too flattering note. And I," she said, glancing carelessly at the mantelpiece on which a letter was placed, "have written the necessary acknowledgment. It would be absurd to stand on ceremony with the harmless old gentleman who met us on the bridge. How fat he is! And what a wonderful pipe he carries almost as fat as himself!" Alas for Mr. Engelmann! I could not resist saying a word in his favor. She spoke of him with such cruelly sincere contempt. "Though he only saw you for a moment," I said, "he is your ardent admirer already." "Is he, indeed?" She was so utterly indifferent to Mr. Engelmann's admiration that she could hardly take the trouble to make that commonplace reply. The next moment she dismissed the subject. "So you have written to Fritz?" she went on. "Have you also written to your aunt?" "Yes, by the same post." "Mainly on business, no doubt. Is it indiscreet to ask if you slipped in a little word about the hopes that I associate with Mrs. Wagner's arrival at Frankfurt?" This seemed to give me a good opportunity of moderating her "hopes" in mercy to her daughter and herself. "I thought it undesirable to mention the subject, for the present at least," I answered. "There is a serious difference of opinion between Mrs. Wagner and Mr. Keller, on a subject connected with the management of the office here. I say serious, because they are both equally firm in maintaining their convictions. Mr. Keller has written to my aunt by yesterday's post, and I fear it may end in an angry correspondence between them." I saw that I had startled her. She suddenly drew her chair close to mine. "Do you think the correspondence will delay your aunt's departure from England?" she asked. "On the contrary. My aunt is a very resolute person, and it may hasten her departure. But I am afraid it will indispose her to ask any favors of Mr. Keller, or to associate herself with his personal concerns. Any friendly intercourse between them will indeed be impossible, if she asserts her authority as head partner, and forces him to submit to a woman in matters of business." She sank back in her chair. "I understand," she said faintly. While we had been talking, Minna had walked to the window, and had remained there, looking out. She suddenly turned round as her mother spoke. "Mamma, the lady's little boy has just gone out. Shall I tap at the window and call him back?" The widow roused herself with an effort. "What for, my love?" she asked absently. Minna pointed to the mantelpiece. "To take your letter to Mr. Engelman, mamma." Madame Fontaine looked at the letter, paused for a moment, and answered, "No, my dear, let the boy go. It doesn't matter for the present." She turned to me with an abrupt recovery of her customary manner. "I am fortunately for myself a sanguine person," she resumed. "I always did hope for the best; and, feeling the kind of motive of what you have said to me, I shall hope for the best still. Minna, my darling, Mr. David and I have been talking on dry subjects until we are tired. Give us a little music." While her daughter obediently opened the piano, she looked at the flowers. "You are fond of flowers, David," she went on. "Do you understand the subject? I ignorantly admire the lovely colors, and enjoy the delicious scents, and I can do no more. It was really very kind of your old friend Mr. Engelman. Does he take part in any of this deplorable difference of opinion between your aunt and Mr. Keller?" What did that new allusion to Mr. Engelman mean? And why had she declined to dispatch her letter to him when the opportunity offered of sending it by the boy? Troubled by the doubts which these considerations suggested, I committed an act of imprudence. I replied so reservedly that I put her on her guard. All I said was that I supposed Mr. Engelman agreed with Mr. Keller, but that I was not in the confidence of the two partners. From that moment she saw through me, and was silent on the subject of Mr. Engelman. Even Minna's singing had lost its charm in my present frame of mind. It was a relief to me when I could make my excuses and leave the house. On my way back to Main Street, when I could think freely, my doubts began to develop into downright suspicion. Madame Fontaine could hardly hope, after what I had told her, to obtain the all important interview with Mr. Keller, through my aunt's intercession. Had she seen her way to trying what Mr. Engelman's influence with his partner could do for her? Would she destroy her formal acknowledgment of the receipt of his flowers as soon as my back was turned, and send him a second letter encouraging him to visit her? And would she cast him off without ceremony when he had served her purpose? These were the thoughts that troubled me on my return to the house. When we met at supper, some hours later, my worst anticipations were realized. Poor innocent Mr. Engelman was dressed with extraordinary smartness, and was in the highest good spirits. Mr. Keller asked him jestingly if he was going to be married. In the intoxication of happiness that possessed him, he was quite reckless. He actually retorted by a joke on the sore subject of the employment of women. "Who knows what may happen," he cried gaily, "when we have young ladies in the office for clerks?" Mr. Keller was so angry that he kept silence through the whole of our meal. When Mr. Engelman left the room I slipped out after him. "You are going to Madame Fontaine's?" I said. He smirked and smiled. "Just a little evening visit, David. Aha! You young men are not to have it all your own way." He laid his hand tenderly on the left breast pocket of his coat. "Such a delightful letter!" he said. "It is here, over my heart. No! A woman's sentiments are sacred. I mustn't show it to you." I was on the point of telling him the whole truth, when the thought of Minna checked me for the time. My interest in preserving Mr. Engelman's tranquillity was in direct conflict with my interest in the speedy marriage of my good friend Fritz. Besides, was it likely that anything I could say would have the slightest effect on the deluded old man in the first fervor of his infatuation? I thought I would give him a general caution, and wait to be guided by events. "One word, sir, for your private ear," I said. "Even the finest women have their faults. You will find Madame Fontaine perfectly charming, but don't be too ready to believe that she is in earnest." Mr. Engelman felt infinitely flattered, and owned it with the slightest reserve. "Oh, David, David!" he said, "are you jealous of me already?" He put on his hat with a jaunty twist on one side, and swung his stick gayly, and left the room. For the first time in my experience of him, he went out without his pipe; and, a more serious symptom still, he really did not appear to miss it. Chapter 11 Part 1. Of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 12. 2 days passed, and I perceived another change in Mr. Engelman. He was now transformed into a serious and reticent man. Had he committed indiscretions which might expose him to ridicule if they were known? Or had the widow warned him not to be too ready to take me into his confidence? In any case, he said not one word to me about Madame Fontaine's reception of him, and he left the house secretly when he paid his next visit to her. Having no wish to meet him unexpectedly, and feeling, if the truth be told, not quite at ease about the future, I kept away from Minna and her mother, and waited for events. On the third day, an event happened. I received a little note from Minna. "Dear Mr. David, if you care to see mamma and me, stay at home this evening. Good Mr. Engelman has promised to show us his interesting old house, after business hours." There was nothing extraordinary in making an exhibition of the old house. It was one among the many picturesque specimens of the domestic architecture of bygone days, for which Frankfurt is famous; and it had been sketched by artists of all nations, both outside and in. At the same time, it was noticeable, perhaps only as a coincidence, that the evening chosen for showing the house to the widow, was also the evening on which Mr. Keller had an engagement with some friends in another part of the city. As the hour approached for the arrival of the ladies, I saw that Mr. Engelman looked at me with an expression of embarrassment. "Are you not going out this evening, David?" he asked. "Am I in the way, sir?" I inquired mischievously. "Oh, no. In that case, then, I think I shall stay at home." He said no more, and walked up and down the room with an air of annoyance. The bell of the street door rang. He stopped, and looked at me again. "Visitors?" I asked. He was obliged to answer me. "Friends of mine, David, who are coming to see the house." I was just sufficiently irritated by his persistence in keeping up the mystery to set him the example of speaking plainly. "Madame Fontaine and her daughter?" I asked. He turned quickly to answer me, and hesitated. At the same moment, the door was opened by the sour old housekeeper, frowning suspiciously at the two elegantly dressed ladies whom she ushered into the room. If I had been free to act on my own impulse, I should certainly, out of regard for Mr. Engelman, have refrained from accompanying the visitors when they were shown over the house. But Minna took my arm. I had no choice but to follow Mr. Engelman and her mother when they left the room. Minna spoke to me as confidentially as if I had been her brother. "Do you know," she whispered, "that nice old gentleman and mamma are like old friends already? Mamma is generally suspicious of strangers. Isn't it odd? And she actually invites him to bring his pipe when he comes to see us. He sits puffing smoke and admiring mamma, and mamma does all the talking. Do come and see us soon. I have nobody to speak to about Fritz. Mamma and Mr. Engelman take no more notice of me than if I were a little dog in the room." As we passed from the ground floor to the first floor, Madame Fontaine's admiration of the house rose from one climax of enthusiasm to another. Among the many subjects that she understood, the domestic architecture of the 17th century seemed to be one, and the art of water color painting soon proved to be another. "I am not quite contemptible as a lady artist," I heard her say to Mr. Engelman, "and I should so like to make some little studies of these beautiful old rooms, as memorials to take with me when I am far away from Frankfurt. But I don't ask it, dear Mr. Engelman. You don't want enthusiastic ladies with sketch books in this bachelor paradise of yours. I hope we are not intruding on Mr. Keller. Is he at home?" "No," said Mr. Engelman. "He has gone out." Madame Fontaine's flow of eloquence suddenly ran dry. She was silent as we ascended from the first floor to the second. In this part of the house our bedrooms were situated. The chamber in which I slept presented nothing particularly worthy of notice; but the room occupied by Mr. Keller and Mr. Engelman contained some of the finest carved woodwork in the house. It was beginning to get dark. Mr. Engelman lit the candles in his own room. The widow took one of them from him, and threw the light skillfully on the different objects about her. She was still a little subdued, but she showed her knowledge of wood carving by picking out the two finest specimens in the room, a wardrobe and a toilet table. "My poor husband was fond of old carving," she explained modestly. "What I know about it I know from him. Dear Mr. Engelman, your room is a picture in itself. What glorious colors! How simple and how grand! Might we—" She paused, with a becoming appearance of confusion. Her voice dropped softly to lower tones. "Might we be pardoned, do you think, if we ventured to peep into Mr. Keller's room?" She spoke of Mr. Keller's room as if it had been a shrine, approachable only by a few favored worshippers. "Where is it?" she inquired, with breathless interest. I led the way out into the passage, and threw open the door without ceremony. Madame Fontaine looked at me as if I had committed an act of sacrilege. Mr. Engelman, following us with one of his candles, lit an ancient brass lamp which hung from the middle of the ceiling. "My learned partner," he explained, "does a great deal of his reading in his bedroom, and he likes plenty of light. You'll have a good view when the lamp has burnt up. The big chimney piece is considered the finest thing of that sort in Frankfurt." The widow confronted the chimney piece, and clasped her hand in silent rapture. When she was able to speak, she put her arm around Minna's waist. "Let me teach you, my love, to admire this glorious work," she said, and delivered quite a little lecture on the merits of the chimney piece. "Oh, if I could but take the merest sketch of it!" she exclaimed, by way of conclusion. "But no, it is too much to ask." She examined everything in the room with the minutest attention. Even the plain little table by the bedside, with a jug and a glass on it, did not escape her observation. "Is that his drink?" she asked, with an air of respectful curiosity. "Do you think I might taste it?" Mr. Engelman laughed. "It's only barley water, dear lady," he said. "Our rheumatic old housekeeper makes as few journeys as possible up and down stairs. When she sets the room in order in the evening, she takes the night drink up with her, and so saves a second journey." "Taste it, Minna," said the widow, handing the glass to her daughter. "How refreshing! How pure!" Mr. Engelman, standing on the other side of her, whispered in her ear. I was just behind them, and could not help hearing him. "You will make me jealous," he said. "You never noticed my night drink. "I have beer." The widow answered him by a look. He heaved a little sigh of happiness. Poor Mr. Engelmann! Minna innocently broke in on this mute scene of sentiment. She was looking at the pictures in the room, and asked for explanations of them which Mr. Engelmann could only afford. It struck me as odd that her mother's artistic sympathies did not appear to be excited by the pictures. Instead of joining her daughter at the other end of the room, she stood by the bedside with her hand resting on the little table, and her eyes fixed on the jug of barley water, absorbed in thought. On a sudden she started, turned quickly, and caught me observing her. I might have been deceived by the lamplight, but I thought I saw a flash of expression under her heavy eyelids, charged with such intensity of angry suspicion that it startled me. She was herself again, before I could decide whether to trust my own strong impression or not. "Do I surprise you, David?" she asked in her gentlest tones. "I ought to be looking at the pictures, you think? My friend, I can't always control my own sad recollections. They will force themselves on me, sometimes when the most trifling associations call them up. Dear Mr. Engelman understands me. He, no doubt, has suffered too. May I sit down for a moment?" She dropped languidly into a chair, and sat looking at the famous chimney piece. Her attitude was the perfection of grace. Mr. Engelman hurried through his explanation of the pictures, and placed himself at her side, and admired the chimney piece with her. "Artists think it looks best by lamplight," he said. "The big pediment between the windows keeps out the light in the daytime." Madame Fontaine looked round at him with a softly approving smile. "Exactly what I was thinking myself, when you spoke," she said. "The effect by this light is simply perfect. Why didn't I bring my sketch book with me? I might have stolen some little memorial of it in Mr. Keller's absence." She turned towards me when she said that. "If you can do without colors," I suggested. "We have paper and pencils in the house." The clock in the corridor struck the hour. Mr. Engelman looked uneasy, and got up from his chair. His action suggested that the time had passed by us unperceived, and that Mr. Keller's return might take place at any moment. The same impression was evidently produced on Minna. For once in her life, the widow's quick perception seemed to have deserted her. She kept her seat as composedly as if she had been at home. "I wonder whether I could manage without my colors," she said placidly. "Perhaps I might try." Mr. Engelman's uneasiness increased to downright alarm. Minna perceived the change, as I did, and at once interfered. "I am afraid, mamma, it is too late for sketching to night," she said. "Suppose Mr. Keller should come back?" Madame Fontaine rose instantly with a look of confusion. "How very stupid of me not to think of it!" she exclaimed. "Forgive me, Mr. Engelman. I was so interested, so absorbed. Thank you 1,000 times for your kindness." She led the way out, with more apologies and more gratitude. Mr. Engelman recovered his tranquillity. He looked at her lovingly, and gave her his arm to lead her downstairs. On this occasion, Minna and I were in front. We reached the first landing, and waited there. The widow was wonderfully slow in descending the stairs. Judging by what we heard, she was absorbed in the old balusters now. When she at last joined us on the landing, the doors of the rooms on the first floor delayed her again. It was simply impossible, she said, to pass them without notice. Once more, Minna and I waited on the ground floor. Here, there was another ancient brass lamp which lighted the hall, and therefore another object of beauty which it was impossible to pass over in a hurry. "I never knew mamma to behave so oddly before," said Minna. "If such a thing wasn't impossible, in our situation, one must really think she wanted Mr. Keller to catch us in the house." There was not the least doubt in my mind, knowing as I did how deeply Madame Fontaine was interested in forcing her acquaintance on Mr. Keller, that this was exactly what she did want. Fortune is proverbially said to favor the bold, and fortune offered to the widow the perilous opportunity of which she had been in search. While she was still admiring the lamp, the grating sound became audible of a key put into the street door. The door opened, and Mr. Keller walked into the hall. He stopped instantly at the sight of two ladies who were both strangers to him, and looked interrogatively at his partner. Mr. Engelman had no choice but to risk an explanation of some kind. He explained, without mentioning names. "Friends of mine, Keller," he said confusedly, "to whom I have been showing the house." Mr. Keller took off his hat, and bowed to the widow. With a boldness that amazed me, under the circumstances, she made a low curtsy to him, smiled her sweetest smile, and deliberately mentioned her name. "I am Madame Fontaine, sir," she said, "and this is my daughter, Minna." End of Chapter 12 of Part 1.
Part 1, Chapter 13 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 13. Mr. Keller fixed his eyes on the window in stern silence, walked past her to the inner end of the hall, and entered a room at the back of the house, closing the door behind him. Even if he had felt inclined to look at Minna, it would not have been possible for him to see her. After a timid glance at him, the poor girl hid herself behind me, trembling piteously. I took her hand to encourage her. "Oh, what hope is there for us," she whispered, "with such a man as that?" Madame Fontaine turned as Mr. Keller passed her, and watched his progress along the hall until he disappeared from view. "No," she said quietly to herself, "you don't escape me in that way." As if moved by a sudden impulse, she set forth on the way by which Mr. Keller had gone before her, walking as he had walked to the door at the end of the hall. I had remained with Minna, and was not in a position to see how her mother looked. Mr. Engelmann's face, as he stretched out his hands entreatingly to stop Madame Fontaine, told me that the fierce passions hidden deep in the woman's nature had risen to the surface and shown themselves. "Oh, dear lady," cried the simple old man, "don't look like that. It's only Keller's temper. He will soon be himself again." Without answering him, without looking at him, she lifted her hand and put him back from her as if he had been a troublesome child. With her firm, graceful step, she resumed her progress along the hall to the room at the end, and knocked sharply at the door. Mr. Keller's voice answered from within. "Who is there?" "Madame Fontaine," said the widow. "I wish to speak to you." "I decline to receive Madame Fontaine." "In that case, Mr. Keller, I will do myself the honor of writing to you." "I refuse to read your letter." "Take the night to think of it, Mr. Keller, and change your mind in the morning." She turned away without waiting for a reply, and joined us at the outer end of the hall. Minna advanced to meet her and kissed her tenderly. "Dear, kind mamma, you are doing this for my sake," said the grateful girl. "I'm ashamed that you should humble yourself. It is so useless." "It shall not be useless," her mother answered. "If 50 Mr. Kellers threatened your happiness, my child, I would brush the 50 out of your way. Oh, my darling, my darling!" Her voice, as firm as the voice of a man, while she declared her resolution, faltered and failed her when the last words of endearment fell from her lips. She drew Minna to her bosom, and embraced in silent rapture the one creature whom she loved. When she raised her head again, she was, to my mind, more beautiful than I had ever yet seen her. The all-ennobling tears of love and grief filled her eyes. Knowing the terrible story that is still to be told, let me do that miserable woman justice. Hers was not a wholly corrupted heart. It was always in Minna's power to lift her above her own wickedness. When she held out the hand that had just touched her daughter to Mr. Engelmann, it trembled as if she had been the most timid woman living. "Good night, dear friend," she said to him. "I'm sorry to have been the innocent cause of this little embarrassment." Simple Mr. Engelmann put his handkerchief to his eyes. Never in all his life had he been so puzzled, so frightened, and so distressed. He kissed the widow's hand. "Do let me see you safe home," he said, in tones of the dearest entreaty. "Not to-night," she answered. He attempted a faint remonstrance. Madame Fontaine knew perfectly well how to assert her authority over him. She gave him another of those tender looks which had already become the charm of his life. Mr. Engelmann sat down on one of the hall chairs, completely overwhelmed. Dear and admirable woman! I heard him say to himself softly. Taking leave of me in my turn, the widow dropped my hand, struck, to all appearance, by a new idea. "I have a favor to ask of you, David," she said. "Do you mind going back with us?" As a matter of course, I took my hat and placed myself at her service. Mr. Engelmann got on his feet and lifted his plump hands in mute and melancholy protest. "Don't be uneasy," Madame Fontaine said to him with a faint smile of contempt. "David doesn't love me." I paused for a moment as I followed her out, to console Mr. Engelmann. "She's old enough to be my mother, sir," I whispered, "and this time, at any rare, she has told you the truth." Hardly a word passed between us on our way through the streets and over the bridge. Minna was sad and silent, thinking of Fritz, and whatever her mother might have to say to me was evidently to be said in private. Arrived at the lodgings, Madame Fontaine requested me to wait for her in the shabby little sitting room, and graciously gave me permission to smoke. "Say good night to David," she continued, turning to her daughter. "Your poor little heart is heavy to night, and mamma means to put you to bed as if you were a child again. Ah me, if those days could only come back!" After a short absence, the widow returned to me with a composed manner and a quiet smile. The meeting with Mr. Keller seemed to have been completely dismissed from her thoughts, in the brief interval since I had seen her last. "We often hear of parents improving their children," she said. "It is my belief that the children quite as often improve the parents. I have had some happy minutes with Minna, and, would you believe it, I am already disposed to forgive Mr. Keller's brutality, and to write him in a tone of moderation, which must surely have its effect. All Minna's doing, and my sweet girl doesn't in the least suspect it herself. If you ever have children of your own, David, you will understand me and feel for me. In the meantime, I must not detain you by idle talk. I must say plainly what I want of you." She opened her writing desk and took up a pen. "If I write to Mr. Keller under your own eye, do you object to take charge of my letter?" I hesitated to answer. To say the least of it, her request embarrassed me. "I don't expect you to give it to Mr. Keller personally," she explained. "It is of very serious importance to me." She laid a marked emphasis on those words. "To be quite sure that my letter has reached him, and that he has really had the opportunity of reading it. And if you will only place it on his desk in the office with your own hand, that is all I ask you to do. For Minna's sake, mind, not for mine." For Minna's sake, I consented. She rose directly, and signed to me to take her place at the desk. "It will save time," she said, "if you write the rough draft of the letter from my dictation. I'm accustomed to dictate my letters, with Minna for secretary. Of course you shall see the fair copy before I seal it." She began to walk up and down the little room with her hands crossed behind her, in the attitude made famous by the great Napoleon. After a minute of consideration, she dictated the draft as follows: "Sir, I am well aware that scandalous reports at Wurzburg have prejudiced you against me. Those reports, so far as I know, may be summed up under 3 heads. First, that my husband died in debt through my extravagance. Second, that my respectable neighbors refuse to associate with me. Third, that I entrapped your son Fritz into asking for my daughter's hand in marriage because I knew his father to be a rich man. To the first calumny I reply that the debts are due to expensive chemical experiments in which my late husband engaged, and that I have satisfied the creditors to the last farthing. Grant me an audience, and I will refer you to the creditors themselves. To the second calumny I reply that I received invitations on my arrival to Wurzburg, after my marriage, from every lady of distinguished social position in the town. After experience of the society thus offered to me, I own to having courteously declined subsequent invitations, and having devoted myself in retirement to my husband, to my infant child, and to such studies in literature and art as I had time to pursue. Gossip and scandal, with an eternal accompaniment of knitting, are not to my taste, and while I strictly attend to domestic duties, I do not consider them as constituting, in connection with tea drinking, the one great interest of a woman's life. I plead guilty to having been foolish enough to openly acknowledge these sentiments, and to having made bitter enemies everywhere as the necessary consequence. If this plain defense of myself fails to satisfy you, grant me an audience, and I will answer your questions, whatever they may be. To the third calumny I reply that if you had been a prince instead of a merchant, I would still have done everything in my power to keep your son away from my daughter, for this simple reason, that the idea of parting with her to any man fills me with grief and dismay. I only yielded to the marriage engagement when the conviction was forced upon me that my poor child's happiness depended on her union with your son. It is this consideration alone which induces me to write to you, and to humiliate myself by pleading for a hearing. As for the question of money, if through some unexpected misfortune you became bankrupt tomorrow, I would entreat you to consent to the marriage exactly as I entreat you now. Poverty has no terrors for me while I have health to work, but I cannot face the idea of my child's life being blighted, because you choose to believe the slanders that are spoken of her mother. For the third time, I ask you to grant me an audience, and to hear me in my own defense." There she paused and looked over my shoulder. "I think that's enough," she said. "Do you see anything objectionable in my letter?" How could I object to the letter? From beginning to end it was strongly and yet moderately expressed. I resigned my place at the desk, and the widow wrote the fair copy with her own hand. She made no change whatever, except by adding these ominous lines as a postscript: "I implore you not to drive me to despair. A mother who is pleading for her child's life, it is nothing less in this case, is a woman who surely asserts a sacred claim. Let no wise man deny it." "Do you think it's quite discreet," I ventured to ask, "to add those words?" She looked at me with a moment's furtive scrutiny, and only answered after she had sealed the letter and placed it in my hands. "I have my reasons," she replied. "Let the words remain." Returning to the house at rather a late hour for Frankfurt, I was surprised to find Mr. Keller waiting to see me. "I have had a talk with my partner," he said. "It has left, for the time only, I hope, a painful impression on both sides, and I must ask you to do me a service in the place of Mr. Engelmann, who has an engagement to morrow which prevents him from leaving Frankfurt." His tone indicated plainly enough that the engagement was with Madame Fontaine. Hard words must have passed between the two old friends on the subject of the widow. Even Mr. Engelmann's placid temper had, no doubt, resented Mr. Keller's conduct at the meeting in the hall. "The service I ask of you," he resumed, "will be easily rendered. The proprietor of a commercial establishment at Hanau is desirous of entering into business relations with us, and has sent references to respectable persons in the town and neighborhood, which is necessary to verify. We are so busy in the office that it is impossible for me to leave Frankfurt myself or to employ our clerks on this errand. I have drawn out the necessary instructions, and Hanau, as you are aware, is within an easy distance of Frankfurt. Have you any objection to be the representative of the house on this matter?" It is needless to say that I was gratified by the confidence that had been placed in me, and eager to show that I really deserved it. We arranged that I should leave Frankfurt by the earliest conveyance the next morning. On our way upstairs to our bedchambers, Mr. Keller detained me for a moment more. "I have no claim to control you in the choice of your friends," he said, "but I am old enough to give you a word of advice. Don't associate yourself too readily, David, with the woman whom I found here to-night." He shook hands cordially and left me. I thought of Madame Fontaine's letter in my pocket, and felt a strong conviction that he would persist in his refusal to read it. The servants were the only persons stirring in the house when I rose the next morning. Unobserved by anyone, I placed the letter on the desk in Mr. Keller's private room. That done, I started on my journey to Hanau. End of chapter 13, part 1. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Chapter 14 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 14. Thanks to the instructions confided to me, my errand presented no difficulties. There were certain persons to whom I was introduced, and certain information to be derived from them, which it was my duty to submit to Mr. Keller on my return. Fidelity was required of me, and discretion was required of me, and that was all. At the close of my day's work, the hospitable merchant, whose references I had been engaged in verifying, refused to permit me to return to the hotel. His dinner hour had been put off expressly to suit my convenience. "You will only meet the members of my family," he said, "and a cousin of my wife's who is there with her daughter, on a visit to us, Frau Meyer of Würzburg." I accepted the invitation, feeling privately an Englishman's reluctance to confronting an assembly of strangers, and anticipating nothing remarkable in reference to Frau Meyer, although she did come from Würzburg. Even when I was presented to the ladies in due form as the honored representative of Mr. Keller of Frankfurt, I was too stupid, or too much absorbed in the business on which I had been engaged, to be much struck by the sudden interest with which Frau Meyer regarded me. She was a fat, florid old lady, who looked coarsely clever and resolute. She had a daughter who promised to resemble her but too faithfully in due course time. It was a relief to me at dinner to find myself placed between the merchant's wife and her eldest son. They were far more attractive neighbors at table, to my thinking, than Frau Meyer. Dinner being over, we withdrew to another room to take our coffee. The merchant and his son, both ardent musicians in their leisure hours, played a sonata for pianoforte and violin. I was at the opposite extremity of the room, looking at some fine proof impressions of prints from the old masters, when a voice at my side startled me by an unexpected question. "May I ask, sir, if you are acquainted with Mr. Keller's son?" I looked round and discovered Frau Meyer. "Have you seen him lately?" she proceeded, when I had acknowledged that I was acquainted with Fritz. "And can you tell me where he is now?" I answered both these questions. Frau Meyer looked thoroughly well satisfied with me. "Let us have a little talk," she said, and seated herself and signed to me to take a chair near her. "I felt a true interest in Fritz," she resumed, lowering her voice so as not to be heard by the musicians at the other end of the room. "Until to-day I have heard nothing of him since he left Wurzburg. I like to talk about him. He once did me a kindness a long time since. I suppose you are in his confidence? He has told you why his father sent him away from the university?" My reply to this was, I am afraid, rather absently given. The truth is, my mind was running on some earlier words which had dropped from the old lady's lips. He once did me a kindness a long time since. When had I last heard that commonplace phrase? And why did I remember it so readily when I now heard it again? Ah, his father did a wise thing in separating him from that woman and her daughter, Frau Meyer went on. Madame Fontaine deliberately entrapped the poor boy into the engagement. But perhaps you are a friend of hers? In that case, I retract and apologize." "Quite needless," I said. "You are not a friend of Madame Fontaine?" she persisted. This cool attempt to force an answer from me failed in its object. It was like being cross-examined in a court of law, and, in our common English phrase, it set my back up. In the strict sense of the word, Madame Fontaine might be termed an acquaintance, but certainly not a friend of mine. For once I took the prudent course, and said, "No." Frau Meyer's expansive bosom emitted a hearty sigh of relief. "Ah," she said, "now I can talk freely in Fritz's interest. Mind, you are a young man like himself. He will be disposed to listen to you. Do all you can to back his father's influence and cure him of his infatuation. I tell you plainly, his marriage would be his ruin." "You speak very strongly, madam. Do you object to the young lady?" "Not I. A harmless, insignificant creature, nothing more and nothing less. It's her vile mother that I object to." "As I have heard, Frau Meyer, there are two sides to that question. Fritz is persuaded that Madame Fontaine is an injured woman. He assures me, for instance, that she is the fondest of mothers." "Bah! What does that amount to? It's as much a part of a woman's nature to take her child when she has got one, as it is to take to her dinner when she is hungry. A fond mother? What stuff! Why, a cat is a fond mother. What's the matter?" "A cat is a fond mother." Another familiar phrase, and this time a phrase remarkable enough to lead my memory back in the right direction. In an instant I recollected the anonymous letter to Fritz. In an instant I felt the conviction that Frau Meyer, in her eagerness to persuade me, had unconsciously repeated two of the phrases which she had already used in her eagerness to persuade Fritz. No wonder I started in my chair when I felt that I was face to face with the writer of the anonymous letter. I made some excuse, I forget what, and hastened to resume the conversation. The opportunity of making discoveries which might be invaluable to Fritz, to say nothing of good Mr. Engelmann, was not an opportunity to be neglected. I persisted in quoting Fritz's authority. I repeated his assertion relative to the love of scandal at Wurzburg, and the envy of Madame Fontaine's superior attractions felt among the ladies. Frau Meyer laughed disdainfully. "Poor Fritz," she said, "an excellent disposition, but so easily persuaded, so much too amiable. Our being all envious of Widow Fontaine is too ridiculous. It is a mere waste of time to notice such nonsense. Wait a little, Mr. David, and you will see. If you and Mr. Keller can only keep Fritz out of the widow's way for a few months longer, his eyes will be opened in spite of himself. He may yet come back to us with a free heart, and he may choose his future wife more wisely next time." As she said this, her eyes wandered away to her daughter at the other end of the room. Unless her face betrayed her, she had evidently planned, at some past time, to possess herself of Fritz as a son-in-law, and she had not resigned the hope of securing him yet. Madame Fontaine might be a deceitful and dangerous woman, but what sort of witness against her was this abusive old lady, the unscrupulous writer of an anonymous letter? "You prophesy very confidently about what is to come in the future," I ventured to say. Frau Meyer's red face turned a shade redder. "Does that mean that you don't believe me?" she asked. "Certainly not, madam. It only means that you speak severely of Dr. Fontaine's widow, without mentioning any facts that justify you." "Oh, you want facts, do you? I'll show you whether I know what I'm talking about or not. Has Fritz mentioned that among Madame Fontaine's other virtues she has paid her debts? I'll tell you how she's paid them as an example, young gentleman, that I am not talking at random. Your admirable widow, sir, is great at fascinating old men. They're always falling in love with her, the idiots. A certain old man at Würzburg, close on 80, mind, was one of her victims. I had a letter this morning which tells me that he was found dead in his bed 2 days since, and that his nephew is the sole heir to all that he leaves behind him. Examination of his papers has shown that he paid the widow's creditors, and that he took a promissory note from her. Ha, ha, ha! A promissory note from a woman without a farthing, in payment of the sum that he had advanced. The poor old man would, no doubt, have destroyed the note if he had known that his end was so near. His sudden death has transferred it to the hands of his heir. In money matters, the nephew is reported to be one of the hardest men living. When that note falls due, he will present it for payment. I don't know where Madame Fontaine is now. No matter. Sooner or later she is sure to hear of what has happened, and she must find the money, or see the inside of a debtor's prison. Those are the facts that I had in mind, Mr. David, when I spoke of events opening Fritz's eyes to the truth." I submitted with all possible humility to the lady's triumph over me. My thoughts were with Minna. What a prospect for the innocent, affectionate girl! Assuming the statement that I had just heard to be true, there was surely a chance that Madame Fontaine, with time before her, might find the money. I put this view of the case to Frau Meyer. "If I didn't know Mr. Keller to be a thoroughly resolute man," she answered, "I should say that she might find the money too. She has only to succeed in marrying her daughter to Fritz, and Mr. Keller would be obliged to pay the money for the sake of the family credit. But he is one of the few men whom she can't twist around her finger. If you ever fall in with her, take care of yourself. She may find your influence with Fritz an obstacle in her way, and she may give you reason to remember that the mystery of her husband's lost chest of poisons is not cleared up yet. It was all in the German newspapers. You know what I mean." This seemed to be passing all bounds of moderation. "And you know, madam," I answered sharply, "that there was no evidence against her, nothing whatever, to associate her with the robbery of the medicine chest." "Not even suspicion, Mr. David?" "Not even suspicion." I rose from my chair as I spoke. Minna was still in my thoughts. I was not merely unwilling, I was almost afraid to hear more. "1 minute," said Frau Meyer. "Which of the 2 hotels here are you staying at? I want to send you something to read to night, after you have left us." I told her the name of the hotel, and we joined our friends at the other end of the room. Not long afterwards I took my leave. My spirits were depressed. A dark cloud of uncertainty seemed to hang over the future. Even the prospect of returning to Frankfurt the next day became repellent to me. I was almost inclined to hope that my aunt might, as Mr. Keller had predicted, recall me to London. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Chapter 15 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins, Part 1, Chapter 15. From these reflections, I was roused by the appearance of a waiter with a letter for me. The envelope contained a slip cut from a German newspaper, and these lines of writing, signed by Frau Meyer: "You are either a very just or a very obstinate young man. In either case, it will do you no harm to read what I enclose. I am not such a scandal-mongering old woman as you seem to think. The concealment of the names will not puzzle you. Please return the slip. It belongs to our excellent host, and forms part of his collection of literary curiosities." Such was the introduction to my reading. I translate it from the German newspaper into English as literally as I can. The editor's few prefatory words were at the top of the column, bearing the date of September 1828. "We have received, in strictest confidence, extracts from letters written by a lady to a once beloved female friend. The extracts are dated and numbered, and are literally presented in this column, excepting the obviously necessary precaution of suppressing names, places, and days of the month. Taken in connection with a certain inquiry which is just now occupying the public mind, these fragments may throw some faint glimmer of light on events which are at present involved in darkness. Number 1, 1809. Yes, dearest Julie, I have run the grand risk. Only yesterday I was married to Dr. The people at the church were our only witnesses. My father declares that I have degraded his noble blood by marrying a medical man. He forbade my mother to attend the ceremony. Poor simple soul! She asked me if I loved my young doctor, and was quite satisfied when I said yes. As for my father's objections, my husband is a man of high promise in his profession. In his country, I think I told you in my last letter that he was a Frenchman, a famous physician is ennobled by the state. I shall leave no stone unturned, my dear, to push my husband forward, and when he is made a baron, we shall see what my father will say to us then. Number 2, 1810. We have removed, my Julie, to this detestably dull old German town for no earthly reason but that the university is famous as a medical school. My husband informs me in his sweetest manner that he will hesitate at no sacrifice of our ordinary comforts to increase his professional knowledge. If you could see how the ladies dress in this lost hole of a place, if you could hear the twaddle they talk, you would pity me. I have but one consolation, a lovely baby, Julie, a girl. I had almost said an angel. Were you as fond of your first child, I wonder, as I am of mine? And did you utterly forget your husband while the little darling was first put into your arms? Write and tell me. Number 3, 1811. I have hardly patience to take up my pen but I shall do something desperate if I don't relieve my overburdened mind in some way. After I wrote to you last year, I succeeded in getting my husband away from the detestable university, but he persisted in hanging about Germany and conferring with mouldy old doctors, whom he calls princes of science, instead of returning to Paris, taking a handsome house, and making his way to the top of the tree with my help. I am the very woman to give brilliant parties and to push my husband's interests with powerful people of all degrees. No, I really must not dwell on it. When I think of what has happened since, it will drive me mad. 6 weeks ago a sort of medical congress was announced to be at the university. Something in the proposed discussion was to be made the subject of a prize essay. The doctor's professional interest in this matter decided him on trying for the prize, and the result is our return to the hateful old town and its society. Of course my husband resumes his professional studies. Of course I am thrown once more among the dowdy gossiping women. But that is far from being the worst of it. Among the people in the school of chemistry here, there is a new man who entered the university shortly after we left it last year. This devil, it is the only right word for him, has bewitched my weak husband, and for all I can see to the contrary, has ruined our prospects in life. He is a Hungarian, small, dirty, lean as a skeleton, with hands like claws, eyes like a wild beast's, and the most hideously false smile that you ever saw in a human face. What his history is nobody knows. The people at the medical school call him the most extraordinary experimental chemist living. His ideas astonish the professors themselves. The students have named him the new Paracelsus. I ventured to ask him one day if he believed he could make gold. He looked at me with his frightful grin and said, "Yes, and diamonds too, with time and money to help me." He not only believes in the philosopher's stone, he said he is on the trace of some explosive compound so terrifically destructive in its effect that it will make war impossible. He declares that he will annihilate time and space by means of electricity, and that he will develop steam as a motive power until travelers can rush over a whole habitable globe at the rate of a mile in a minute. Why do I trouble you with these ravings, my dear? This boastful adventurer has made himself master of my husband, has talked him out of his senses, has reduced my influence over him to nothing. Do you think I am exaggerating? Hear how it has ended. My husband absolutely refuses to leave this place. He cares no longer even to try for the prize. The idea of medical practice has become distasteful to him, and he has decided on devoting his life to discovery in chemical science. And this is the man whom I married, with the sincerest belief in the brilliant social career that was before him. For this contemptible creature I have sacrificed my position in the world, and alienated my father from me forever. I may look forward to being the wife of a poor professor who shows experiments to stupid labs in a school, and the friends in Paris, who, to my certain knowledge, are now waiting to give him introductions to the imperial court itself, may transfer their services to some other man. No words can tell you what I feel at this complete collapse of all my hopes and plans. The one consideration of my child is all that restrains me from leaving my husband, never to see him again. As it is, I must live a life of deceit, and feign respect and regard for a man whom I despise with my whole heart. Power! Oh, if I had the power to make the fury that consumes me felt! The curse of our sex is its helplessness. Every day, Julie, the conviction grows on me that I shall end badly. Who among us knows the capacity for wickedness that lies dormant in our natures until the fatal event comes and calls it forth. No, I am letting you see too much of my tortured soul. Let me close my letter and play with my child. Number 4, 1812. My heartfelt congratulations, dearest, on your return to Germany after your pleasant visit to the United States, and more congratulations yet on the large addition to your income, due to your husband's intelligence and spirit of enterprise on American ground. Ah, you have married a man. Happy woman! I am married to a machine. Why have I left your kind letters from America without reply? My Julie, I have constantly thought of you, but the life I lead is slowly crushing my energies. Over and over again I have taken up my pen, and over again I have laid it aside, recoiling from the thought of myself and my existence, too miserable, perhaps too proud, to tell you what a wretched creature I am, and what thoughts come to me sometimes in the wakeful hours of the night. After this confession, you wonder, perhaps, why I write to you now. I really believe it is because I have been threatened with legal proceedings by my creditors, and have just come victoriously out of a hard struggle to appease them for the time. This little fight has roused me from my apathy. It has rallied my spirits and made me feel like my old self again. I am no longer content with silently loving my dearest friend. I open my heart and write to her. Oh dear, how sad that she should be in debt! I can hear you say this, and sigh to yourself, you who have never known what it is to be in want of money since you were born. Shall I tell you what my husband earns at the university? No, I feel the blood rushing into my face at the bare idea of revealing it. Let me do the professor justice. My animated mummy has reached the height of his ambition at last. He is professor of chemistry, and is perfectly happy for the rest of his life. My dear, he is as lean and almost as dirty as the wretch who first perverted him. Do you remember my once writing to you about a mysterious Hungarian whom we found in the university? A few years since this man died by suicide, as mysteriously as he had lived. They found him in the laboratory, with a strange inscription traced in chalk on the wall by which he lay dead. These were the words: "After giving it a fair trial, I find that life is not worth living for. I have decided to destroy myself with a poison of my own discovery. My chemical papers and preparations are hereby bequeathed to my friend Dr. , and my body is presented as a free gift to the anatomy school. Let a committee of surgeons and analysts examine my remains. I defy them to discover a trace of the drug that has killed me." And they did try, Julie, and discovered nothing. I wonder whether the suicide has left the receipt for that poison among his other precious legacies to his friend Dr. . Why do I trouble you with these nauseous details? Because they are in no small degree answerable for my debts. My husband devotes all his leisure hours to continuing the detestable experiments begun by the Hungarian, and my yearly dress money for myself and my child has been reduced one half to pay the chemical expenses. Ought I, in this hard case, to have diminished my expenditure to the level of my reduced income? If you say yes, I answer that human endurance has its limits. I can support the martyrdom of my life, the loss of my dearest illusions and hopes, the mean enmity of our neighbors, the foul-mouthed jealousy of the women, and more than all, the exasperating patience of a husband who never resents the hardest things I can say to him, and who persists in loving and admiring me as if we were only married last week. But I cannot see my child in a stuff frock on promenade days in the palace gardens, when other people's children are wearing silk, and plain as my own dress may be, I must and will have the best material that is made. When the wife of the military commandant, a woman sprung from the people, goes out in an Indian shawl with Brussels lace in her bonnet, am I to meet her and return her bow in a Camelot cloak and a beaver hat? No. When I lose my self-respect, let me lose my life too. My husband may sink as low as he pleases. I always have stood above him, and I always will. And so I am in debt, and my creditors threaten me. What does it matter? I have pacified them for the time with some small installments of money and a large expenditure of smiles. I wish you could see my darling little Minna. She is the loveliest and sweetest child in the world, my pride at all times, and my salvation in my desperate moods. There are moments when I feel inclined to set fire to the hateful university and destroy all the moldy old creatures who inhabit it. I take Minna out and buy her a little present, and see her eyes sparkle and her color rise, and feel her innocent kisses, and become for a while quite a good woman again. Yesterday her father no, I shall work myself up into a fury if I tell you about it. Let me only say that Minna saved me as usual. I took her to the jeweler's and bought her a pair of pearl earrings. If you could have heard her, if you could have seen her when the little angel first looked at herself in the glass! I wonder when I shall pay for the earrings. Ah, Julie, if I only had such an income as yours, I would make my power felt in this place. The insolent women should fawn on me and fear me. I would have my own house and establishment in the country to purify me after the atmosphere of the professor's drugs. I would well, never mind what else I would have. Talking of power, have you read the account of the execution last year of that wonderful criminal, Anna Maria Zwanziger? Wherever she went, the path of this terrific woman is strewed with the dead whom she has poisoned. She appears to have lived to destroy her fellow creatures, and to have met her doom with the most undaunted courage. What a career, and what an end! [Footnote: The terrible career of Anna Maria Zwanziger, sentenced to death at Bamberg in the year 1811, will be found related in Lady Duff Gordon's translation of Feuerbach's Criminal Trials. The foolish people in Wurzburg are at a loss to find motives for some of the murders she committed, and try to get out of the difficulty by declaring that she must have been a homicidal maniac. That is not my explanation. I can understand the murderess becoming morally intoxicated with the sense of her own tremendous power. A mere human creature, only a woman, Julie, armed with the means of secretly dealing death with her wherever she goes, meeting with strangers who displease her, looking at them quietly and saying to herself, "I doom you to die before you are a day older." Is there no explanation here of some of Zwanziger's poisonings which are incomprehensible to commonplace minds? I put this view, in talking of the trial, to the military commandant a few days since. His vulgar wife answered me before he could speak. "Madame Fontaine," said this spitfire, "my husband and I don't feel your sympathy with poisoners." Take that as a specimen of the ladies of Wurzburg. And let me close this unmercifully long letter. I think you will acknowledge, my dear, that when I do write, I place a flattering trust in my friend's patient remembrance of me." There the newspaper extracts came to an end. As a picture of a perverted mind, struggling between good and evil, and slowly losing ground under the stealthy influence of temptation, the letters certainly possessed a melancholy interest for any thoughtful reader. But, not being a spiteful woman, I failed to see in these extracts the connection which Frau Meyer had attempted to establish between the wickedness of Madame Fontaine and the disappearance of her husband's medicine chest. At the same time I must acknowledge that a vague impression of distrust was left on my mind by what I had read. I felt a certain sense of embarrassment at the prospect of renewing my relations with the widow on my return to Frankfurt, and I was also conscious of a decided increase of anxiety to hear what had been Mr. Keller's reception of Madame Fontaine's letter. Add to this that my brotherly interest in Minna was sensibly strengthened, and the effect on me of the extracts in the newspaper is truly stated, so far as I can remember it at this distant time. On the evening of the next day I was back again at Frankfurt. End of chapter 15. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Chapter 16 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 16. Mr. Keller and Mr. Engelmann were both waiting to receive me. They looked over my written report of inquiries at Hanau, and expressed the warmest approval of it. So far all was well. But when we afterwards sat down to our supper, I noticed a change in the two partners, which it was impossible to see without regret. On the surface they were as friendly towards each other as ever, but a certain constraint of look and manner, a palpable effort on either side to speak with the old unsought ease and gaiety, showed that the disastrous discovery of Madame Fontaine in the hall had left its evil results behind it. Mr. Keller retired when the meal was over to examine my report minutely in all its details. When we were alone, Mr. Engelmann lit his pipe. He spoke to me once more with the friendly familiarity of past days before he met the too fascinating widow on the bridge. "My dear boy, tell me frankly, did you notice any change in Keller?" "I see a change in both of you," I answered. "You are not such pleasant companions as you used to be." Mr. Engelmann blew out a mouthful of smoke, and followed it by a heavy sigh. "Keller has become so bitter," he said. "His hasty temper I never complained of, as you know. But in these later days he is hard, hard as stone. Do you know what he did with dear Madame Fontaine's letter? A downright insult, David. He sent it back to her." "Without an explanation or apology?" I asked. "With a line on the envelope: 'I warned you that I should refuse to read your letter. You see that I am a man of my word.' What a message to send to a poor mother who only asks leave to plead for her child's happiness. You saw the letter. Enough to melt the heart of any man, as I should have thought. I spoke to Keller on the subject. I really couldn't help it." "Wasn't that rather indiscreet, Mr. Engelmann?" "I said nothing that could reasonably offend him. Do you know of some discreditable action on the part of Madame Fontaine which has not been found out by anyone else?" I asked. "I know the character she bears in Wurzburg," he said, "and the other night I saw her face. That is all I know, friend Engelmann, and that is enough for me." With those sour words he walked out of the room. What lamentable prejudice! What an unchristian way of thinking! The name of Madame Fontaine will never be mentioned between us again. When that much injured lady honors me with another visit, I can only receive her where she will be protected from insult, in a house of my own. "Surely you are not going to separate yourself from Mr. Keller?" I said. "Not for the present. I will wait till your aunt comes here and brings that restless reforming spirit of hers into the business. Changes are sure to follow, and my change of residence may pass as one of them." He got up to leave the room, and stopped at the door. "I wish you would come with me, David, to Madame Fontaine's. She is very anxious to see you." Feeling no such anxiety on my side, I attempted to excuse myself, but he went on without giving me time to speak. "Nice little Miss Minna is very dull, poor child. She has no friend of her own age here at Frankfurt, excepting yourself, and she has asked me more than once when Mr. David would return from Hanau." My excuses failed me when I heard this. Mr. Engelmann and I left the house together. As we approached the door of Madame Fontaine's lodging, it was opened from within by the landlady, and a stranger stepped out into the street. He was sufficiently well dressed to pass for a gentleman, but there were obstacles in his face and manner to a successful personation of the character. He cast a peculiarly furtive look at both of us, as we ascended the house steps. I thought he was a police spy. Mr. Engelmann set him down a degree lower in the social scale. "I hope you're not in debt, ma'am," he said to the landlady. "That man looks to me like a bailiff in disguise." "I manage to pay my way, sir, though it is a hard struggle," the woman replied. "As for the gentleman who has just gone out, I know no more of him than you do." "May I ask what he wanted here?" "He wanted to know when Madame Fontaine was likely to quit my apartments. I told him my lodger had not appointed any time for leaving me yet." "Did he mention Madame Fontaine's name?" "Yes, sir." "How did he know that she lived here?" "He didn't say." "And you didn't think of asking him?" "It was very stupid of me, sir. I only asked him how he came to know that I let apartments. He said, 'Never mind now. I'm well recommended, and I'll call again, and tell you about it.' And then I opened the door for him, as you saw." "Did he ask to see Madame Fontaine?" "No, sir." "Very odd," said Mr. Engelmann, as we went upstairs. "Do you think we ought to mention it?" I thought not. There was nothing at all uncommon in the stranger's inquiries, taken by themselves. We had no right, that I could see, to alarm the widow, because we happened to attach purely fanciful suspicions to a man of whom we knew nothing. I expressed this opinion to Mr. Engelmann, and he agreed with me. The same subdued tone which had struck me in the little household in Main Street was again visible in the welcome which I received in Madame Fontaine's lodgings. Minna looked weary of waiting for the long expected letter from Fritz. Minna's mother pressed my hand in silence with a melancholy smile. Her reception of my companion struck me as showing some constraint. After what had happened on the night of her visit to the house, she could no longer expect him to help her to an interview with Mr. Keller. She was merely keeping up appearances, on the chance that he might be useful to her in some other way. The trifling change which I observed did not appear to present itself to Mr. Engelmann. I turned away to Minna. Knowing what I knew, it grieved me to see that the poor old man was fonder of the widow and prouder of her than ever. It was no very hard task to revive the natural hopefulness of Minna's nature. Calculating the question of time in the days before railroads, I was able to predict the arrival of Fritz's letter in 2 or at most 3 days more. This bright prospect was instantly reflected in the girl's innocent face. Her interest in the little world about her revived. When her mother joined us in our corner of the room, I was telling her all that could be safely related of my visit to Hanau. Madame Fontaine seemed to be quite as attentive as her daughter to the progress of my trivial narrative, to Mr. Engelmann's evident surprise. "Did you go farther than Hanau?" the widow asked. "No farther." "Were there any guests to meet you at the dinner party?" "Only the members of the family." "I lived so long, David, in dull old Würzburg, that I can't help feeling a certain interest in the town. Did the subject turn up? Did you hear of anything that was going on there?" I answered this as cautiously as I had answered the questions that had gone before it. Frau Meyer had, I fear, partially succeeded in perverting my sense of justice. Before my journey to Hanau, I might have attributed the widow's inquiries to mere curiosity. I believed suspicion to be the ruling motive with her now. Before any more questions could be asked, Mr. Engelmann changed the topic to a subject of greater interest to himself. "I have told David, dear lady, of Mr. Keller's inhumane reception of your letter." "Don't say inhumane," Madame Fontaine answered gently. "It is I alone who am to blame. I have been a cause of estrangement between you and your partner, and I have destroyed whatever little chance I might once have had of setting myself right in Mr. Keller's estimation, all due to my rashness in mentioning my name. If I had been less fond of my little girl here, and less eager to seize the first opportunity of pleading for her, I should never have committed that fatal mistake." So far this was sensibly said, and, as an explanation of her own imprudence, was unquestionably no more than the truth. I was less favorably impressed by what followed, when she went on: "Pray understand, David, that I don't complain. I feel no ill will towards Mr. Keller. If chance placed the opportunity of doing him a service in my hands, I should be ready and willing to make use of it. I should be only too glad to repair the mischief that I have so innocently done." She raised her handkerchief to her eyes. Mr. Engelmann raised his handkerchief to his eyes. Minna took her mother's hand. I alone sat undemonstrative, with my sympathies in a state of repose. Frau Meyer again. Nothing but the influence of Frau Meyer could have hardened me in this way. "I have entreated our sweet friend not to leave Frankfurt in despair," Mr. Engelmann explained in faltering tones. "Although my influence with Keller is, for the present, a lost influence in this matter, I am more than willing, I am eager to speak to Mrs. Wagner on Madame Fontaine's behalf. My advice is, wait for Mrs. Wagner's arrival, and trust to my zeal and my position in the firm. When both his partners summon him to do justice to an injured woman, even Keller must submit." The widow's eyes were still hidden behind her handkerchief, but the lower part of her face was visible. Unless I completely misinterpreted the mute language of her lips, she had not the faintest belief in the fulfillment of Mr. Engelmann's prediction. Whatever reason she might have for remaining in Frankfurt, after the definite rejection of her too confident appeal to Mr. Keller's sympathies, was thus far undoubtedly a reason known only to herself. That very night, after we had left her, an incident occurred which suggested that she had some motive for ingratiating herself with one of the servants in Mr. Keller's house. Our domestic establishment indoors consisted of the sour-tempered old housekeeper, who was perfectly unapproachable, of a little kitchen maid, too unimportant a person to be worth conciliating, and of the footman Joseph, who performed the usual duties of waiting on us at table and answering the door. This last was a foolish young man, excessively vain of his personal appearance, but a passably good servant, making allowances for these defects. Having occasion to ring for Joseph to do me some little service, I noticed that the loose ends of his necktie were connected by a smart new pin, presenting a circle of malachite set in silver. "Have you had a present lately?" I asked, "or are you extravagant enough to spend your money on buying jewelry?" Joseph simpered in undisguised satisfaction with himself. "It's a present, sir, from Madame Fontaine. I take her flowers almost every day from Mr. Engelmann, and I have done one or two trifling errands for her in the town. She was pleased with my attention to her wishes. 'I have very little money, Mr. Joseph,' she said. 'Oblige me by accepting this pin in return for the trouble I have given you.' And she took the pin out of the beautiful white lace round her neck, and made me a present of it with her own hand. A most liberal lady, isn't she, sir?" "Liberal indeed, Joseph, considering the small services which you seem to have rendered to her. Are you quite sure that she doesn't expect something more of you?" "Oh, quite sure." He blushed as he said that, and rather hurriedly left the room. How would Frau Meyer have interpreted Joseph's blushes, and the widow's liberality? I went to bed without caring to pursue that question. A lapse of 2 days more brought with it two interesting events: the opening night of a traveling opera company on a visit to Frankfurt, and the arrival by a late post of our long expected letters from London. The partners, both of them ardent lovers of music, had taken a box for the short season, and, with their usual kindness, had placed a seat at my disposal. We were all three drinking our coffee before going to the theater, and Joseph was waiting on us, when the rheumatic old housekeeper brought in the letters and handed them to me as the person who sat nearest to the door. "Why, my good creature, what has made you climb the stairs when you might have rung for Joseph?" asked kind-hearted Mr. Engelmann. "Because I've got something to ask of my masters," answered crabbed Mother Barbara. "There are your letters to begin with. Is it true that you are, all three of you, going to the theater to-night?" She never used any of the ordinary terms of respect. If she had been their mother instead of their housekeeper, she could not have spoken more familiarly to the two old gentlemen who employed her. "Well," she went on, "my daughter is in trouble about her baby, and wants my advice. Teething and convulsions and that sort of thing. As you're all going out for the evening, you don't want me, after I've put your bedrooms tidy. I can go to my daughter for an hour or two, I suppose. And Joseph, who isn't of much use, heaven knows, can take care of the house." Mr. Keller, refreshing his memory of the opera of the night, Gluck's Armida, by consulting the book, nodded and went on with his reading. Mr. Engelmann said, "Certainly, my good soul. Give my best wishes to your daughter for the baby's health." Mother Barbara grunted and hobbled out of the room. I looked at the letters. 2 were for me, from my aunt and Fritz. One was for Mr. Keller, addressed also in the handwriting of my aunt. When I handed it to him across the table, he dropped Armida the moment he looked at the envelope. It was the answer to his remonstrance on the subject of the employment of women. For Minna's sake, I opened Fritz's letter first. It contained the long expected lines to his sweetheart. It went out at once, and, enclosing the letter in an envelope, sent Joseph away with it to the widow's lodgings before Mother Barbara's departure, made it necessary for him to remain in the house. Fritz's letter to me was very unsatisfactory. In my absence, London was unendurably dull to him, and Minna was more necessary to the happiness of his life than ever. He desired to be informed by return post of the present place of residence of Madame Fontaine and her daughter. If I refused to comply with this request, he could not undertake to control himself, and he thought it quite likely that he might follow his heart's dearest aspirations, and set forth on the journey to Frankfurt in search of Minna. My aunt's letter was full of the subject of Jack's straw. In the first place, she had discovered, while arranging her late husband's library, a book which had evidently suggested his ideas of reformation in the treatment of the insane. It was called Description of the Retreat, an institution near York for insane persons of the Society of Friends, written by Samuel Tuke. She had communicated with the institution, had received the most invaluable help, and would bring the book with her to Frankfurt, to be translated into German in the interests of humanity. [Footnote: Tuke's description of the retreat near York is reviewed by Sydney Smith in a number of the Edinburgh Review for 1814. As for her merciful experiment with poor Jack, it had proved to be completely successful, with one serious drawback. So long as he was under her eye, and in daily communication with her, a more grateful, affectionate, and perfectly harmless creature never breathed the breath of life. Even Mr. Hartrey and the lawyer had been obliged to confess that they had been in the wrong throughout, in the view they had taken of the matter. But when she happened to be absent from the house for any length of time, it was not to be denied that Jack relapsed. He did nothing that was violent or alarming. He merely laid himself down on the mat before the door of her room, and refused to eat, drink, speak, or move until she returned. He heard her outside the door before anyone else was aware that she was near the house, and his joy burst out in a scream which did certainly recall Bedlam. That was the drawback, and the only drawback. And how she was able to take the journey to Frankfurt, which Mr. Keller's absurd remonstrance had rendered absolutely necessary, was more than my aunt's utmost ingenuity could thus far discover. Setting aside the difficulty of disposing of Jack, there was another difficulty represented by Fritz. It was in the last degree doubtful if he could be trusted to remain in London in her absence. "But I shall manage it," the resolute woman concluded. "I never yet despaired of anything, and I don't despair now." Returning to the sitting room, when it was time to go to the theatre, I found Mr. Keller with his temper in a flame, and Mr. Engelmann silently smoking as usual. "Read that!" cried Mr. Keller, tossing my aunt's reply to him across the table. "It won't take long." It was literally a letter of 4 lines. "I have received your remonstrance. It is useless for two people who disagree as widely as we do to write to each other. Please wait for my answer until I arrive at Frankfurt." "Let's go to the music," cried Mr. Keller. "God knows I want a composing influence of some kind." At the end of the first act of the opera, a new trouble exhausted his small stock of patience. He had been too irritated on leaving the house to remember his opera glass, and he was sufficiently near-sighted to feel the want of it. It is needless to say that I left the theatre at once to bring back the glass in time for the next act. My instructions informed me that I should find it on his bedroom table. I thought Joseph looked confused when he opened the house door to me. As I ran upstairs, he followed me, saying something. I was in too great a hurry to pay attention to him. Reaching the second floor by 2 stairs at a time, I burst into Mr. Keller's room, and found myself face to face with Madame Fontaine. End of chapter 16, part 1. Recording by Sandra Estenson.